The storm had arrived with a vengeance. Gale force winds roared through the North Ridge Mountains, bending the pines and rattling the walls of Willow Haven, the isolated cabin where Margaret Lawson had spent the past 17 winters. The fire in the stone hearth crackled, casting restless shadows across the wooden beams, but it did little to warm the growing unease in her chest. She had lived through brutal storms before. Mountain life demanded resilience, but the warnings had been dire. This was the worst blizzard in decades, a force of nature that cared little for human preparations. Margaret wrapped her hands around a steaming mug of chamomile tea, her fingers brushing against the worn gold band still resting on her ring finger. It had been almost a year since Daniel had passed, leaving her to face the seasons alone. The silence had settled into her life like an unwelcome guest, persistent and heavy. Yet tonight, something about the quiet felt unnatural. Even the birds had vanished hours ago, their absence unsettling. Then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. At first, she dismissed it as the wind shrieking through the trees, but then it came again, a faint, high-pitched cry, barely audible over the howling gusts. It was not human, but it carried something that made her breath catch, a raw, primal desperation. Margaret stiffened, her pulse quickening. Logic warned her to stay inside. Venturing into a blizzard was foolish, even deadly. But the cry came again, weaker now, pleading. Her grip tightened on the flashlight as she pulled her heavy coat from the hook by the door. Snow burst into the cabin as she cracked the door open, the wind clawing at her with icy fingers. She hesitated, heart hammering. Then, jaw set, she stepped into the storm. The cold was a living thing, wrapping itself around Margaret Lawson as she fought through the knee-deep snow. The wind howled like a chorus of tormented souls, tearing at her coat, whipping frozen strands of hair against her face. The beam of her flashlight barely cut through the blinding white, illuminating nothing but swirling chaos. She could still hear the cry, softer now, almost swallowed by the storm. Dear God, what am I doing? The thought clawed at the edges of her mind, but her feet kept moving. She had heard desperation before, in the hospital room where Daniel had taken his final breath. This was different, but no less urgent. Her boots crunched over ice-crusted drifts as she reached the woodshed, the source of the sound. Snow had nearly buried it, the structure sagging under the storm's relentless weight. Then, just beyond the stacked firewood, she saw them. Two small figures, huddled together in the narrow gap beneath the shed. Their fur was matted with ice, tiny bodies trembling violently. Their eyes, wide, glowing orbs reflecting the flashlight's beam, locked onto her, filled with instinctual fear, but also something deeper. A plea. Margaret's breath hitched. Wolf pups. Every survival instinct screamed at her to turn back. These were wild animals, creatures meant to endure the wilderness or perish in its grip. Interfering went against every rule of nature. Then the smaller one collapsed with a pitiful whimper, too weak to move. The sound pierced her chest like a knife. Damn it, she whispered, stripping off her scarf and inching forward, her hand outstretched. Come on, little one, stay with me. She knew this was reckless, but as she wrapped their fragile bodies in the fabric and pulled them close, shielding them from the unforgiving storm, she also knew she could never have left them behind. The warmth of the cabin enveloped Margaret Lawson. As she kicked the door shut against the raging storm, snow still clinging to her coat, her boots leaving wet tracks across the wooden floor. The bundle in her arms barely stirred, two fragile bodies wrapped tightly in her scarf. She moved quickly, kneeling by the fire as she laid them on a thick towel, her hands trembling as she unwrapped them. The smaller pup, its fur tinged with russet around the ears, was barely breathing. The larger one, though thin and weak, lifted its head slightly, golden eyes darting around the unfamiliar surroundings. Margaret worked fast, rubbing their fur with an old flannel cloth, trying to coax warmth back into their frozen limbs. They were so small, their ribs showing through their damp coats. How long had they been out there, alone in the cold? She grabbed the kettle from the stove, pouring warm, not hot water into a bowl, mixing in just a touch of honey. Using an old turkey baster, she carefully dripped the liquid into the smaller pup's mouth. At first, nothing. Then a flicker of movement, a weak swallow. Margaret exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The larger pup let out a low, wary growl, his instincts warning him against the unfamiliar human scent. But Margaret wasn't deterred. Good. You've got some fight in you. That's what you need to survive. The hours blurred together in a rhythm of tending, watching, waiting. She kept the fire steady, checking their breathing, whispering soft reassurances into the quiet cabin. By dawn, the storm had finally begun to settle, but her battle was far from over. The larger pup, Frost, as she had come to call him, was alert, his eyes constantly tracking her movements, though he remained too weak to move much. The smaller one, Ember, remained distressingly still. Margaret hesitated before reaching for her old medical bag, the same one she had used for years when Daniel's illness had progressed. It felt surreal to be here now, repurposing those skills not for a dying husband, but for 2 orphaned wolves. She checked Ember's pulse. Weak, but there. As the sun cast pale light through the frost-covered windows, Ember stirred. Just a twitch at first, then a slow, trembling movement of her tiny paw. Margaret bit back a relieved sob. She had no idea what she had just set in motion, but she knew one thing for certain. These wolves had a chance now, and she wouldn't let them go without a fight. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine as Margaret Lawson stood at the edge of the enclosure, hands gripping the wooden gate. Beyond it, Frost and Ember paced restlessly, their lean bodies tense with an energy that had outgrown the confines of her barn. They were no longer the fragile pups she had pulled from the storm months ago. Their thick coats gleamed in the sunlight, their muscles rippled with the strength of young predators on the brink of their true nature. Today was the day. Dr. Rebecca Winters stood beside her, adjusting the settings on the tracking collars secured around the wolves' necks. "They're ready," she said, her voice carrying both certainty and the quiet weight of farewell. Margaret swallowed, nodding, though her throat was tight. This was the goal from the start: to heal them, to prepare them, to send them back. But now that the moment had arrived, the thought of letting go gnawed at something deep inside her. She reached for the latch, hesitating for only a second before pulling it free. The gate swung open with a creak. Frost was the first to move. He stepped forward cautiously, ears pricked, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. The moment stretched long and still, the forest before them humming with unseen life. Then, as if some invisible tether had snapped, he broke into a run, his powerful frame cutting through the underbrush with effortless grace. Ember lingered. She turned her golden eyes toward Margaret, and for a fleeting heartbeat, there was something there, a flicker of recognition, of understanding that went beyond instinct. Then, with a soft whine, she turned and followed her brother into the trees, vanishing into the wild that had always been their home. Margaret exhaled shakily, forcing herself to unclench her hands. Beside her, Dr. Winters watched the tracking monitor as the wolves' signals moved deeper into the protected wilderness. "They're doing exactly what they should be," she reassured. Margaret nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on the tree line, now silent. They were gone. And yet, as the wind shifted through the pines, carrying a distant, lingering howl, Margaret knew this wasn't truly goodbye. The first time Margaret Lawson noticed something unusual, she dismissed it as coincidence. A few scattered rabbit bones near the back of her property, barely visible beneath the fallen pine needles. She assumed it was the work of scavengers, perhaps a fox passing through. Then it happened again. And again. One morning, just after the season's first frost, she stepped onto her porch and found something strange at the edge of her clearing. 3 fish, neatly arranged on the wooden steps. Their bodies were still fresh, the scent of the river clinging to their scales. Margaret's breath caught. This wasn't a random kill. It was deliberate. She knelt, fingers brushing the cold flesh of the fish, her mind racing. There was only one possibility that made sense, though it defied everything she knew about wolves. Frost. Ember. The thought sent a chill up her spine, though not from fear. It was something else, something closer to awe. Days passed, then weeks. More signs appeared. A partially eaten deer carcass left just beyond the garden fence, no tracks leading away from it. Fallen branches and brush mysteriously cleared from her usual walking path after a storm. The sense of being watched, not with malice, but with quiet recognition. One night, as the first true snowfall blanketed Pinecrest Valley, Margaret stepped outside, drawn by an instinct she couldn't explain. The moon bathed the landscape in silver light, and as she scanned the tree line, she saw them. Two figures stood at the edge of the forest, tall, powerful, unmistakable. Frost, his massive frame tense but unthreatening. Ember, her golden eyes locked onto Margaret with an intensity that sent a shiver through her bones. Margaret stood frozen, heart pounding. She should have been afraid, but she wasn't. Instead, she did something she never would have imagined. She knelt just as she had on that night long ago, when two helpless cubs had huddled against the cold beneath her woodshed. For a long moment, there was only silence, the night holding its breath. Then Ember took a single step forward, her head tilting in what could only be described as acknowledgement. Margaret didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, as if satisfied, Ember turned, disappearing into the shadows. Frost followed, his movements fluid, silent. The forest swallowed them whole. Margaret stayed there long after they had gone, the crisp night air biting at her skin, her heart hammering with something she couldn't name. They hadn't returned for food, for shelter. They had returned for her. The storm had been relentless for days, burying Pinecrest Valley under a thick, unforgiving layer of snow. Margaret Lawson had spent the evening by the fire, listening to the wind wailing against the cabin walls, her mind drifting to thoughts of Frost and Ember. It had been nearly a year since she last saw them at the tree line, their silent farewell etched into her memory. Then, the phone rang. Margaret grabbed the receiver, her stomach tightening at the urgency in Frank Dawson's voice. "We've got a situation," he said, the static from the storm making his words crackle. "Trail cameras picked up a lone wolf near Aspen Grove, female. Injured. She's limping badly, struggling in the deep snow. It looks like Ember." Margaret felt a jolt, her breath catching. "She's alone?" "Seems like it," Frank confirmed. "No sign of Frost or a pack, and there's something else." A pause. "The footage suggests she's nursing. We think she's had pups." Margaret's heart pounded. Pups in this storm. Frank hesitated before speaking again. "We're stretched thin dealing with this blizzard. The earliest we can reach her is tomorrow, if the weather lets up." Tomorrow was too late. Margaret was already pulling on her heavy coat, her decision made before Frank even finished his warning. "Send me the coordinates," she said, reaching for her snowshoes. "I'll find her." The trek through the storm was brutal. Snow pelted her face, ice crusted her scarf, and the wind howled with merciless fury. But she pressed on, following the GPS signal, every step sinking into the deep drifts. Then she saw it. A sheltered hollow beneath a fallen pine, barely visible through the snow. A dark shape curled inside. Ember. Margaret approached carefully, her voice low, steady. "It's me, girl. I'm here." Golden eyes flickered open, clouded with exhaustion. Her body was gaunt, her fur matted with ice, one hind leg twisted at an unnatural angle. And nestled against her belly, barely visible beneath the thick fur, three tiny, shivering pups. Margaret's throat tightened. She had fought through the storm to keep them alive. Kneeling slowly, she reached into her pack, pulling out a thermal blanket. "You're not alone this time," she whispered. Ember didn't move, but her gaze locked onto Margaret's. And for the first time in years, the wild wolf let herself be saved once more. The hum of medical equipment filled the air at Whispering Pines Wildlife Center, a stark contrast to the howling blizzard that had nearly claimed Ember and her newborn pups just days ago. Margaret Lawson stood beside Dr. Rebecca Winters, watching as the veterinarian carefully examined the injured wolf. Ember lay stretched out on a padded table, her ribs visible beneath her thick coat, her breath shallow but steady. The sedative kept her calm, but even in sleep, she radiated the quiet strength that had always defined her. "She's tougher than I thought," Dr. Winters murmured, running her fingers gently along Ember's injured leg. "Fractured, but not beyond repair. With time and proper care, she'll make a full recovery." Margaret exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. The memory of finding Ember curled around her pups, barely clinging to life, still haunted her. But now, against all odds, she had been given another chance. A soft whimper drew Margaret's attention to a smaller enclosure where Ember's three pups huddled together. Tiny, fragile, but alive. They had survived the storm, survived the impossible. Dr. Winters studied them with the quiet intensity of a scientist witnessing something unprecedented. These pups, they're special, Margaret. Margaret frowned. Special how? The veterinarian hesitated before responding. We ran genetic tests. Their father was a member of the Clearwater Pack, one of the dominant males. She paused. But based on the markers, that male was Frost. Margaret's breath caught. Frost, Ember's own brother? Dr. Winters nodded, as if anticipating her shock. This kind of sibling pairing is almost unheard of in wild wolves. Normally, packs prevent inbreeding through strict hierarchies and dispersal patterns, but Frost and Ember, they weren't raised in a pack. They grew up together in a unique environment, bonded not by instinct, but by survival. Their connection defied the natural order. Margaret's gaze drifted back to Ember. The wolf had not only survived, but had created new life, a lineage shaped by something beyond mere genetics, something shaped by trust, by the time they had spent under her care. Dr. Winters straightened, a gleam of excitement in her eyes. This changes everything. Their behavior, their bond. It challenges what we understand about wolf social structures. We need to study them, learn from them. Margaret nodded, though her thoughts were elsewhere. She had always known Frost and Ember were different. Now, the world would know it too. The first snowfall of the season dusted the landscape in silence, blanketing Pinecrest Valley in an untouched sea of white. From the porch of Willow Haven, Margaret Lawson watched as the cold settled over the land, her breath curling into the air like wisps of smoke. It had been months since Ember's rescue, months of recovery, of study, of learning just how much these wolves had changed not only their own fate, but the understanding of an entire species. Ember had healed. Stronger now, her golden eyes burned with the fire of survival. Her pups, once fragile bundles of fur, had grown into sleek young wolves, their playful nips and tumbles showing none of the hardship that had marked their birth. And now, as winter closed in, the time had come for them to take their rightful place in the wild. Margaret stood with Dr. Rebecca Winters and Frank Dawson, watching as the wolves' enclosure was carefully opened. The pups hesitated only for a moment before darting forward, their bodies moving with an instinct they had never been taught but had always known. Ember lingered. She turned, her gaze locking onto Margaret's. It was the same look she had given her the night she left the first time, a silent acknowledgement, an unspoken bond that neither of them fully understood. Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her chest. "Go on, girl. You're free." And then, like a whisper in the wind, Ember was gone. As the wolves melted into the forest, Frank let out a low breath. "Never thought I'd see something like this." Dr. Winters smiled. "We've barely scratched the surface. Their survival, their choices, it's rewriting what we know about these animals." Margaret nodded but said nothing. She didn't need research papers to tell her what she already knew, that compassion, given freely, creates ripples far beyond what the giver can ever see. As the wolves' distant howls echoed through the valley, Margaret turned toward the cabin, her heart lighter than it had been in years. They were where they belonged, and so was she.